So here we go. Now you'll notice that every now and then I drink from my cup of tea because I'm an Englishman, and if I don't have my morning tea, I can't function.
Yes, wonderful.
Now, I'm going to talk about Charles Darwin. Are you getting me clear? Am I coming through properly?
Yes, completely.
Good. Now, I want to start by showing you the room that I'm in. It's my living room, and I'm a professor, so you can see that there's lots and lots and lots of books all around.
Wonderful.
And most of them, not all of them, are to do with evolution, with Darwin, with religion, and all the implications. And I'm sitting in my armchair, and if I just turn this way a little bit, you will see on the wall, I have 4 portraits. And I'm going to get up a little closer just to show you and your team or your students exactly who they are. Just a sec.
Sure.
So, if you can see them, right at the top, I have Bishop Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley. And then down below, that's Richard Owen, and that, of course, is Charles Darwin. Can you see that?
Yes.
Good. So, those are the inspirations for what I do. You see it?
Yes.
Good. And so, I write books on and about Darwin. And this is one I recently wrote called Darwinism as Religion. And the subtitle is What Literature Tells Us About Evolution. So, I am 78 years old, and I have devoted the last 50 years or so to studying Darwin. Now, I would say that I did not start to study Darwin because of his relationship to religion. I was brought up as a Christian. I was brought up as a Quaker. That's the pacifist group. And about the age of 20, I lost my faith. It has not returned. But about the age of 25, I was looking for a research topic. I'm a philosopher, and I was looking for a research topic, and I hit on Darwin and the philosophical, if you like, implications of his work. Now, I did this for 2 reasons, and I think it's worth giving you some background so your students particularly will understand how somebody like me thinks. First of all, I did this because I have always been very, very interested in the Victorian period. The great English novelists like Charles Dickens and George Eliot were writing then, and I grew up reading Dickens, and I still read Dickens. I love it. I also lived in a country which was surrounded by great Victorian architecture. There's an awful lot of the buildings in England were built in the 19th century when England was so very, very rich. And so, for instance, we have St Pancras railway station in London, and if you go to Manchester, the Manchester City Hall, in Leeds, close to where I was, the concert hall, and elsewhere. So, starting to work on Darwin was a kind of natural. I mean, I didn't want to write on the philosophy of architecture, for instance. And I was a philosopher rather than a student of literature. So I wasn't going to write on Dickens, even though I love Dickens. But Darwin was a natural. And I expect you've all heard of Thomas Kuhn and his great work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And, of course, that was published in 1962, just as I was coming to philosophical maturity. And one of the things that Kuhn said was, if you want to understand science, you must understand its history. So this led me very much into looking at Darwin, looking at the kind of theory that he produced, and all of these sorts of things. And in fact, I started teaching in Canada in 1965, but I had my first sabbatical, and I bet you know a sabbatical where you have a year off to go and do research. I had my first sabbatical in 1972, and I took the opportunity to go to Cambridge in England, where they have a huge holding of Darwin literature and his private papers and all of these things. And so I spent a year retooling as a historian, so that I was able to get up to speed on Darwin studies. And I found, and I still find it, incredibly interesting. Now, you should understand, as I say, I wasn't yet into the religion side, but I was still doing the science and the philosophical implications. And you'll see that this is all going somewhere. So I was particularly interested in the structure of this book. If you read this book, it's a very easy read for a scientific book. It's not like trying to read Newton with lots of mathematics, where you have to have some proper training in physics in order to understand. You can pick up The Origin of Species, and you can read it.
Of course.
You know, and people have noted, in many respects, it's almost like reading Dickens or George Eliot. It's written in a comfortable style. But the secret is to see that Darwin is using this comfortable style as a kind of tool to put across very audacious arguments. In other words, he knew he was going to shock people. People like Bishop Wilberforce that I showed you earlier. That he knew that what he was going to do would shock people. So he wanted to present his ideas in what we in English would call a user-friendly way. In other words, a way that would not be threatening. That people would say, oh, yes, I know about that. And so he often uses examples from everyday life. For instance, he talks a lot about bees. You know, Now, the thing is, particularly in Victorian England, a lot of the way that people got sweet things, sugar, was from honey. And so a lot of Victorians actually in their back gardens would have a hive or two of bees. In fact, when I grew up just after the Second World War, a lot of people in England still kept bees because this was an easy way to get honey to sweeten things. So everybody knew about bees. So when Darwin started to talk about the queen and the workers and the males, the drones who don't do anything, everybody knew what he was talking about. It wasn't like he was saying, oh, now let me tell you about DNA and about proteins and the Krebs cycle, where you can learn about it, but you have to have at least a high school education, if not a university education, in order to do this. So I discovered that Darwin's book was very carefully designed around the notion of causation. And of course, the greatest scientist in England still was Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton's great achievement was not to put the sun at the center. Copernicus did that. Isaac Newton's great achievement was to explain why these things keep going round, why they don't stop, why the moon doesn't fly off, or why doesn't the moon fall onto the Earth, and that sort of thing. And so, through his force of gravitational attraction, Newton was able to explain exactly why things happen. So Darwin was looking for a biological equivalent of Newtonian gravitation. And he found this through studying the animal and plant breeders in the farmyard. That if you want, let us say, a fatter pig, what you do is you don't just feed your pigs, but you choose as the breeders for the next generation those which are fat, and those which are skinny, you kill off and eat immediately. And so you've always got this selecting and channeling of the features you want. And so Darwin said, aha, that's what I'm looking for. I want to argue for evolution. And Darwin had the idea of a tree of life, that it all comes up, from one, as it were, one tree like that. So this is the stem, and these are cows, and these are oak trees, let us say, and these are humans. So Darwin had this idea, and he discovered this notion of natural selection, which would be the equivalent of artificial selection, which is what the breeders use in the farmyard. Okay? Now, so this was his idea. So, first of all, in the origin, when Darwin was writing this book, the first part, up to about here, is all about artificial selection and how successful breeders have been in making new forms. You start with, well, something like, let us say something like corn, wheat. As you know, wheat started as grasses somewhere in the Middle East, and then people said, aha, the seeds, we can use these. And so farmers said, yes, but this farmer has much better seeds than this farmer, so let's use his and eat these. And so what they did then was they used these for everybody. And then they would say, this chap over here has much better wheat than these people back here. Let's choose this. And of course, as you know, over the years, until we get the very heavy wheat that we know now. So this is what the first part of the origin talks about. Sure. And then in the second part, sort of like this part here, Darwin, what Darwin did was talk about natural selection and how it works in the wild and these sorts of things. And he introduced the idea of a struggle for existence. Darwin was living in Victorian Britain, where population numbers were going up hugely. They started at the beginning of the century with about, let's say 10 million. And they came to the end of the century with about 40 million. And so, of course, you're getting this explosion. But England is just a small country like this. And so what you're getting is more and more people in this small country. And what it meant was what Malthus called a struggle for existence, but really a struggle for reproduction. Because it's no good being big and strong if you don't have babies. So it's reproduction. So Darwin said, there's always going to be population pressures pushing out, but food and space are going to be limited. And so only a few will get through, and the rest will die or not reproduce. And so this will lead to a natural form of selection. And Darwin said that this will also lead to what he called the tree of life. Okay?
Sure.
So then what Darwin does then, what does he do for about 2/3 of the book? What does he do for this last part? What he does is he goes right the way through all of the issues in the animal and plant world, giving explanations. Why do we get very primitive fossils down here, and then the fossils get more and more sophisticated and more until you get up here? Well, because of evolution through natural selection. And one thing that Darwin was particularly pleased with was what he called geographical distribution, or what we today call biogeography, where what you have is these islands. You're looking down on the earth, and these are islands, and you see these are two separate islands and there's sea between them. But they have different organisms, but the organisms are not that different. They're kind of similar, but not that different. And then you have two islands, you can't see it on the screen, two islands way far away, and they're much more different. And Darwin said, why is it that islands like this have very similar organisms, but islands like this, let me show you on the screen. Islands like this have very different organisms. So similar and different. And Darwin said, obviously, because first of all, invaders came to one of the islands and then moved across without much change, and so they evolved separately, but more or less alike. Whereas here, they've had many, many years of separation, and so they've gone their different ways. So this is what Darwin is talking about, giving confirmation in the second half of The Origin of Species. So this was what I worked on very much during the 1970s.
Bravo.
So then what happened was, at the end of the 1970s, 1980s, in America, as you know, as we see now, there are many evangelical Christians, biblical literalists, what came to be known as creationists, people who said the early chapters of Genesis are absolutely, literally true. The earth was founded 6,000 years ago. There was an initial man and woman, Adam and Eve, and then there was a worldwide flood from your part of the world, started in your part of the world, but came to my part of the world. And gosh, this one chap, Noah, built himself a ship, the Ark, and they survived, and nobody else did. They said, this is the truth. This is, if you're going to be a true Christian, you must believe this. But of course, if you're a Darwinian and you believe in evolution through natural selection, you can't believe the Bible. So here we've got then a clash between the Bible on the one hand and Darwinism on the other. And this led to a lot of discussion. And because I was now already had been working on Darwin, I was asked by a number of people to get up and lecture along with the creationists and try to give a different perspective. And this led to, in fact, to me appearing as a witness in a court case in 1981 in the state of Arkansas. That's the state where Bill Clinton was governor. He wasn't governor then. And I went down to testify along with a number of well-known people, including the late Stephen Jay Gould, the very popular paleontologist who wrote Ever Since Darwin and all of those sorts of books, Wonderful Life and those sorts of things. And so, as it were, what we'd say, well, we say it in French, but we use it in English, faute de mieux, by, as it were, by want of a better, by chance. I found myself, on the one hand, if I can be modest, a very well-respected Darwin scholar. And then on the other hand, faced with the existential threat of extreme Christian fundamentalism. And the question is, what was I going to do? Was I going to be engaged in these? Well, and this is why I told you about my background. As I say, I grew up as a Quaker, and although I lost my faith, I still always, and I still do, look back very fondly and very positively on my Christian childhood. I mean, I'm sure you have exactly the same situation in your country. People who say, well, I'm not sure that I would want to say I'm a totally committed Muslim if you ask me about all the details, but at the same time, I grew up as a Muslim, my parents were Muslim, and my teachers were, and I look back on this as a tremendously important and positive aspect of my development. And of course, you might, I don't know to the extent you could say this publicly, but you might well want to say, yes, I disagree with it now, or I disagree with a lot of the things that people want to do with it now. But if I'm going to attack them, it's not because I'm attacking Islam as such, not because I want to challenge whatever I think about Muhammad, but that he was certainly an important and charismatic figure and, you know, his ideas were of great importance, and that's how I feel about Jesus. But I felt very strongly that whatever my personal beliefs were, I owed a great debt to Christianity as a hugely important formative experience upon me. And I'm sure that many of you people I don't know the extent you can express these ideas publicly, but I'm sure that many of you people will know what I'm trying to say, that you don't necessarily buy into, well, you not only don't necessarily, you feel very strongly about some of the more extreme implications that people draw from your religion.
Sure.
But in wanting to attack those, it's not because you're Richard Dawkins and want to get rid of all religion. It's because you, even if you don't accept it yourself, you feel an obligation to speak up for something which was and still is of great social, important, educational relevance to you. So I got very much involved then in not only in sort of more philosophical debates about science and religion, but also some of the broader, what should we say, socio-political debates. Now let me talk just very briefly about these, and I see I've got 10 minutes, so let me end what I'm saying, and then I think this will be a natural break, okay?
Sure.
So on the one hand, I was particularly interested as a philosopher in what is the relationship between, on the one hand, I'm trying to get my hands in the screen. On the one hand, you've got Christianity, and on the other hand, you've got Darwinian evolutionary theory. I mean, now, Christianity isn't just one thing. What Martin Luther believed was not necessarily, let's say, what Pope John Paul believed.
Sure.
And similarly, evolution isn't exactly the same thing. What Charles Darwin believed was not necessarily what 100 years later Stephen Jay Gould believed.
Sure.
But they're in the same camp.
Sure.
The Christians all accept Jesus as the Son of God, as their Saviour, in a way, let's say, distinguishing them from Islam, where Islam looks upon Jesus as a very important prophet, but thinks it's idolatrous to claim that Jesus is in some sense God. I mean, you wouldn't claim that of Muhammad, you wouldn't claim that of Moses, you wouldn't claim that of Jesus.
Sure.
So you've got but the point is, Christians at some level want to say Jesus is all important.
Sure.
And at the other level, Darwinians, even though, like Stephen Jay Gould, they may have big differences with Darwin about speciation, about how new species are formed, they would nevertheless say we're Darwinians in the sense that we believe in the tree of life and we believe that natural selection is all important.
Sure.
So I was dealing then at the philosophical level with, to what extent is there a clash between these? And the answer is yes, no, maybe. In other words, yes, if you're a fundamentalist, if you're a biblical literalist, if you're an extreme evangelical Christian, let us say like Franklin Graham or somebody like that, then obviously at some level you simply cannot accept evolutionary theory because you believe in a special creation, you believe in a unique Adam and Eve, you believe in a worldwide flood, and you believe that, as it were, it's all coming to an end probably fairly shortly with, the second coming in Armageddon. Whereas if you're a Darwinian, you believe in evolution, you believe in natural selection, you believe probably that the first humans were nothing like the numbers we've got now. Maybe they were just 10,000. But there were 10,000, not two. There were 10,000, not just two.
Sure.
So at that level, yes, there is a clash. But of course, a lot of Christians would say, no, we don't accept Genesis as literally true. Of course, we believe that Genesis is true, and I'm sure that people in Islam would say exactly the same. We believe that God was creator, that God created us out of love. He didn't have to, but he did it out of love. That God, whether or not he created just two, or whether he created a whole species, and whether or not he did it through evolution, or whether or not he did it, it meant that humans are special. I mean, I love my dogs, but dogs are dogs, and humans are humans. And our covenant is with God, and dogs, as it were, come on the side. So I felt very strongly, and I've argued this very strongly, I've written a book called "Can a Darwinian Be a Christian?"
Yes.
And what I said there was, yes, I think you can. I think that a Darwinian can certainly, if I wanted to believe in Christianity, the fact that I'm a Darwinian would have nothing to do with it, or at least, if anything, it would make me more of a Christian, that God was able to do things in this wonderful way rather than just through miracles. If I were a Christian, if I accepted this on faith, then for me, Darwinism would be absolutely not a threat at all. As I say, in so many respects, I would welcome, I would be happy to be a Christian. I mean, as it is, I'm not really an outright atheist, I'm more of an agnostic. So if after I die, and I'm 78, so presumably I'll get to know before you do, but if after I die and God's standing there and he says, Michael, you made a big mistake, I'll say, yeah, God, I'm sorry, but you do at least understand that it's exploring evolutionary theory. I was, at some level, exploring the grandeur of your creation. I wasn't turning my back on you.
Of course.
I couldn't accept you. But I was very far from somebody saying, no, 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 like that. So that was the philosophical side of what I was working on. But I also got involved in what we call the more sociological, if you like, psychological side, because having been involved in a court case in Arkansas and seeing the strong opposition of so many Americans to evolutionary theory, and in 2000, I left the job I had in Canada and came down to live in America, mainly because I've got a young family and I didn't want to retire, and here I am at 78 still working. But so I was very conscious of the fact that so many people are opposed to evolution. And I said to myself, why is this? It cannot be because they've studied evolution and think it's wrong. It cannot be because they've studied the Bible properly understood and think that there's a clash. I've tried to show that there isn't. So I think it must be something much more sociological, that somehow evolution represents the other, the existential threat. And of course, we see this in a different way with President Trump. Why do people support him? Even though it's so clear that almost everything he does is wrong. I mean, take his relationship with your country. Now, I don't think it's ever going to be easy peasy in my lifetime, but there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't all be working towards at least some way of living harmoniously together on this globe. You know, I expect that you like to do things that I don't like to do. And I expect you've got habits or customs that I don't particularly like. But at the same time, obviously, by doing this television interview, it shows that we are all children of God. We are all made in the image of God, if you like. And I use that, obviously, for me, it's a metaphor. Sure. But it's a very important metaphor for me. I don't say this just as a joke. I think that there is something very important about being a human being and reaching out to other human beings, and, as I'm doing with you. So, but Trump has really strong supporters, people who say, President Trump can do no wrong, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up, and this sort of thing. Why? Because sociologically, they feel threatened by people like me, that I'm a clever chap who doesn't have to get up in the morning and put on and go and work down in the coal mines or in the factory. My job is sitting in a chair, drinking a cup of tea, talking to somebody like you. So I think there's an awful lot of sociological resentment that we see, particularly around President Trump. And of course, he plays to this. Well, I strongly think that Darwinism, it's not so much the theory that gets to people, but that it represents what we call modernism, science making the decisions rather than faith. That if you've got somebody with a heart attack, better to take them to the doctor than to pray over them. Sure. Doesn't mean either or, but first of all, get them to the doctor as quickly as you can. Or let us say something like sexual behavior of young people. The attitude of people like me is, yes, I think people should respect each other. I don't think boys should just go and have sex with girls just like that. But if 18-year-olds are going to have sex, then at least make sure that they're using contraceptives, that they understand, that they talk about the relationships. Now, of course, this is my position. And of course, you've got your evangelicals who say no sex before marriage and, all of these things. Now, the point is, it's not just a religious divide. It's a social, political, economic divide. You've got rich people like me, and I'm not that rich, but people like me who are professors, who can live in a lovely house like this with all of these books and everything like that. And then you've got people living in apartments, in houses which are cold, which drip, all of these things. And so this is what I've been doing then, writing these books most recently, Darwinism's Religion, where I'm arguing that Darwinism is science, but it's also taken on the guise of a kind of humanistic religion, where, as it were, it's a guide for life. And if you look at people like Richard Dawkins, they want to say, why should we accept Darwinism? Because it's a religious idea. He doesn't say it's a religious idea. And of course, he believes that it leads by progress, the tree of life. But it's not just the tree of life. There's one organism which gets right to the top, and that, of course, is human beings. And I very much expect if he's Richard Dawkins, he thinks that Iranians are here, and the French are here, and the English, happen to be up there, because we all know in England that God is an Englishman. So, it's a joke, but it's true. The English all think that God is an Englishman. So, as I say, Richard Dawkins believes in progress. He believes that humans are special, just like Christians believe that humans are special. So what I see is not so much a clash, but a mirror image of one imaging the other. And of course, as you know, and as I know, there's nothing like religious people for quarreling. Shiites and Sunnis, for instance, in your religion, that you've got on the one, you're both Muslims. You both accept Muhammad as the all-important prophet. You both, you all accept all of these things, and yet you fight each other as much, if not more, than you fight Christians. So what I've been working on most recently, then, as I say, is less the philosophical side to these issues, and more what I call the sociological, if you like, side to these issues. And so that's, as I say, after 50 years, that's where I've ended up. So just to recap, I started working on Darwin because I was interested in the philosophy of science. Thanks to Kuhn, I looked at the history of science. Because I was an Englishman, I grew up loving Victorian Britain, so Darwin was a natural. I spent the first 15 years working on what in philosophy we call epistemological issues, questions about the structure of Darwin's theory, how it works, how Darwin put it together, all of these sorts of things. And then around about 1980, I got involved from outside in issues to do with science and religion. And I picked these up and ran with them. And for 10, 15, 20 years, I worked mainly on, again, philosophical issues. Can science and religion coexist like this? Even if they're different, can they coexist? Or must they always be like this? And I argue, yes, they can coexist. And then for the last 15 or so years, I've been working on the more sociological issues of why is there so much opposition, particularly in places like America, much less so in Canada, for instance, and in England, to Darwinian ideas. And I think it's because the evangelicals particularly represent so very often a lower middle class, working class segment of society who are the people who support Donald Trump, even though he's not doing any good for them. He's helping the really rich people. He's not helping these people. They vote for Trump because he represents an idea that they've got, and they vote against Darwinism because it represents an idea that they don't accept. There you are. Yes. Well, okay, let's talk about the Darwinian Revolution. Darwin published The Origin of Species in, hold on, let me get the origin back up again. Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. In other words, just over 150 years ago. He had been working on the ideas for 20 years, but he didn't actually sit down and write them out as the origin until about a year before, when a young naturalist, a young scientist called Alfred Russel Wallace, sent him an essay with exactly the same ideas, and then Darwin got moving and did this. Sure. But as I say, this wasn't new ideas. So let's go back to the 18th century. Let's go back 100 years before Darwin. And it was about 100 years before Darwin that people first started to think seriously about the possibility of evolution, meaning that you start with very simple forms and then you work up to more and more complex forms until finally you get up to humans at the top. And in fact, one of the first people to think this way was Darwin's grandfather, a man called Erasmus Darwin, who was a physician, a doctor, and he was a particularly keen evolutionist. Now, most people rejected it, not because they were biblical literalists like today's evangelical Christians that I was talking about before the break, but because they saw that let's call it the backbone of evolutionary theory was the idea of progress, that you go from a very simple form, as I say, up through the reptiles, and then up through the apes, and you keep going up and up and up until finally, as I say, you get to humans. And of course, being English, then of course, finally you get to the English, and those Germans who were thinking this said, finally you get to Germans. And of course, the French said, finally you get to the French. But let me assure you, nobody said, finally you get to Iranian.
I see.
You should have had one of your own evolutionists doing that. Perhaps you did. Anyway, so this, by the beginning, Darwin was born in 1809. In fact, he was born on February the 10th, 1809, which is indeed the birth date of February the 12th of Abraham Lincoln, the American president. Sure. So he was born in just while England and France were still fighting the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon was in France and the English were fighting against it, okay? And Darwin grew up in a very comfortable, rich family because his mother's father was Josiah Wedgwood, who was a potter. You know, he made cups and saucers and all of these sorts of things. And even to this day, was a very, very successful businessman. So Darwin grew up in a family with huge amounts of money. It was like he grew up in a family which had invented a computer and was now a multi-billionaire. Sure. So he grew up very comfortably. His father was looking for a job for him that would, as it were, keep him busy, because, as we all know, young men or young women with too much money too quickly often make fools of themselves. They spend all their time drinking and going out after sex and these sorts of things. And Darwin's father, who was a very wise man, was worried. And so Darwin's father pushed Darwin into becoming an Anglican clergyman, in other words, a priest in the Church of England. And Darwin went to Cambridge University intending to do this. And then in 1831, Darwin got the opportunity to go on board HMS Beagle, which was a ship going around the world, mapping around the world.
Sure.
And Darwin got the opportunity to go as a kind of naturalist, a kind of collector of animals and plants and doing some geology. And he did.
Sure.
And it changed his life.
Sure.
He came back in 1836. He was not then an evolutionist, but within a year he accepted evolutionary theory. And then for 18 months he searched to look for a mechanism. And I was talking to you about the mechanism before the break. And he discovered the struggle for existence.
Sure.
He was also looking at what people do in the farmyard. And so he put it all together. And we know, September the 28th, 1838, bingo! Darwin suddenly realized he got it. He found the biological equivalent of Newtonian gravitational theory. Now, he wrote up some early drafts, but he knew that if he published at that time, he would be in deep trouble as a scientist, because all of the important scientists, particularly those interested in geology and biology at that time, were not only Christians, but they did not accept evolution. They did not, by this time, they were not creationists. They believed in a very long earth. They did not believe in a universal flood, but they still believed that God created, as it were, sequentially over the years, rather than up through the tree of life. And so Darwin sat on his ideas and didn't publish them for 15, 20 years. Well, by the mid-1850s, so we're talking 20 years later now, the old people, the old guard, who had been Darwin's friends and mentors when he was a young man, mentors, his teachers,
Yes.
when he was a young man, had either died or retired, were less influential. And by this time, what we call young Turks in England, in other words, young, aggressive go-aheads, like Thomas Henry Huxley,
Yes.
that I showed you right at the beginning of the lecture. These were the people who were dominant. And they, of course, were going to be much more receptive of Darwin's ideas. And so when Wallace sent this essay and Darwin said, what should I do? They all said, Darwin, we know you've been working on these ideas. For God's sakes, get it out. Publish it.
Sure.
In other words, like a PhD supervisor, okay, to the student, you've got some really good ideas, but if you don't publish them, nobody will know about them, and other people will get the ideas before you and get the credit that you should have. So he published The Origin of Species. Now, the interesting thing is, by this time, Darwin was a well-known public figure in England, because in the 1840s, he had published a travel book about the time on the Beagle. So everybody knew who Darwin was. And of course, as I say, he came from a well-known rich family. So Darwin was a well-known public figure. So when Darwin published The Origin of Species, it wasn't like somebody, let us say, from some obscure university in the Canadian Yukon, or from some obscure university in Mississippi.
Sure.
It was like somebody from Harvard or Cambridge, which of course is where he had been, or the Sorbonne, who was a well-known figure. So when Darwin published The Origin, immediately people said, well, whether it's right or whether it's wrong, it's important.
Sure.
And as I said to you before the break, one of the important things about Darwin's theory is that it is very much user-friendly. It's a book that regular people could read.
Sure.
You didn't have to be a scientist to read it.
Of course.
Okay, so Darwin was a well-known figure. And so when he published and people could read it, they started talking about it. Now, as I've said to you, by this time, certainly, there were going to be people who opposed Darwin. And I showed you the picture at the beginning of the talk
Sure.
of Bishop Wilberforce, and he was one who did. But most people, including religious people, certainly in England, and certainly on the in Europe, and mainly in America, particularly in the North. Don't forget, America at this time was still in the Civil War. They had this terrible war going on. But mainly, as I say, most people very quickly accepted evolution. Most people very quickly accepted natural selection. What they all said was, aha, but when it comes to humans, immortal souls or intelligence or something, that required, come on, an intervention. And this book that I also showed you before, you see, everything I do is all part of a net. Sure. It's interwoven.
Of course.
But this book I showed you here, which I published last year, is very much looking at the great literature, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, D.H. Lawrence, and others like this, Dickens, and seeing exactly how they worked with Darwin's ideas, how they incorporated Darwin's ideas into what they were doing, what they were writing, and all of these sorts of things. So, for instance, George Eliot's great novel, Middlemarch, is all about an interconnected net and how it leads to kind of progress, that people are all, those who have energy are the succeeders. They're not necessarily talking about physical reproduction, but they're talking about cultural reproduction. And those who are, as it were, good, move forward, and those who are inadequate move backwards. So Dorothea, the heroine of the novel, she has to learn a lot of things, but at the end of the novel, she has succeeded and moved up. Whereas Lyman, the doctor, who is very intelligent, very talented, but doesn't have the real guts to get out and do something, falls back. And so George Eliot's novel, Middlemarch, is very much influenced by Darwin's ideas, and particularly by Darwin's secondary mechanism of sexual selection. This was an idea that Darwin had. Sometimes it's a question of being, the strongest to get through the winter, but sometimes it's a question of being the strongest to get the prettiest girl. Sure. And that's, as it were, competition for mates. And of course, novelists absolutely loved that. And novel after novel is about how people meet up and mate, and how the people who mate are the ones with not necessarily the most beautiful, but the ones who've got guts, who are prepared, who won't take no for an answer, who strive and push and that. Whereas often the really beautiful ones are the ones who fade away because they're just not good enough. Sure. And so, as I say, this is very much a thing of Victorian England through the 19th century. Now, of course, Darwin's big problem, and I've almost finished, Darwin's big problem was that he didn't really have a proper, adequate mechanism of heredity. Sure. He didn't really know how the genes work, which of course was something that the Austrian monk, Moravian monk Gregor Mendel was working on. Sure. And it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that finally people realized that we've got Darwinism, natural selection on the one hand, and Mendelian genetics on the other. And they're not competitors, which people thought at first, but actually they come together. And this was in the 1930s, particularly due to Ronald Fisher in England and J.B.S. Haldane in England and Sewell Wright, the biologist in America. And they devised what now is known as neo-Darwinism or Darwinism. Or in America, sometimes it's called the synthetic theory of evolution. Sure. So 100 years after the origin, in 1959, basically one had a full working Darwinian theory. The big thing that happened after that, well, two big things. One was the coming of molecular biology, the DNA model. And it's amazing how quickly DNA was incorporated into evolutionary thinking. And now any student who's doing a degree in biology and wants to go on to be an evolutionist would have to take some fairly strong courses in organic chemistry and learn quite a bit about DNA, otherwise you couldn't do modern evolutionary studies. And the other thing which came about was behavior or sociobiology, because it's much easier to study, let's say, a butterfly which is dead and which is laid out on the table like that, and you can look at the colour of the wings, than to study the mating behaviour of a butterfly out in the wild, and you have to get up early and you have to dash around. So, although Darwin always said that behaviour is as important as physical characteristics, for fairly obvious reasons, behaviour was put on the back shelf for 100 years, and it wasn't until the 1960s, thanks to people like John Maynard Smith and William Hamilton and others like that, that behaviour became so very important, which of course it is today. And of course people are particularly interested in applying it to humans. And for instance, what about the differences between men and women? Is it just purely cultural? I mean, do women in your country have to wear head covers and that sort of thing? Is it just purely cultural? Or is it a reflection of innate different standards, that men tend to be more sexual aggressors and women tend to be more homebodies, children awareness? So wearing the head thing is both religious, but it's also a mark of, let's use culture to tame our innate biological nature or something like that. So, as I say, this has been a major development in evolutionary theory today. So looking back on the Darwinian revolution, I would want to say, yes, it was a very, very important revolution. But I think the important thing to note is that it wasn't just a scientific revolution. It was, if you like, a social, religious, yes, although I think religion was changing anyway, thanks to German scholarship and these things. Religion was terribly important. But I think it would be a bad mistake to say the Darwinian revolution was first, foremost and utterly a religious revolution. In many respects, it was more a part cause, part effect, a reflection of social changes, that women were becoming more important. I mean, for instance, this book that I wrote, I discovered when I'd finished it that almost half of my authors, like George Eliot, were women. You know, that women were writing these things. Edith Wharton, others like this, up to today, Marilyn Davis. So, in fact, I see the Darwinian revolution as, yes, tremendously revolutionary. I see it, obviously, as important scientifically. Very. I see it, obviously, as important religiously. But I would be very hesitant just to pick those out as the defining thing. I would be more inclined to say it's more of a social revolution at a more general level. And you just couldn't think at the end of the 19th century in the way that you were thinking at the beginning of the 19th century. And I would put Darwin's Origin of Species right at the centre, which of course it was temporarily anyway, of that. Yes. Well, as I in the interval, I got this book down, and this is Can a Darwinian Be a Christian?
Yes.
And this book, I do try to argue very, very carefully that one can, in fact, be a Darwinian or a Christian.
Yes, yes.
So, as you heard in the first part, my very strong feeling has been that Darwinism and Christianity essentially do not conflict. You might not accept, for instance, I've got many reasons why I don't accept Christianity. I mean, like Darwin, for instance, the Christians, or a lot of Christians say, unless you believe in Jesus, you will not be saved. And I don't want a God which says, Reza, you're not going to be saved because it's unfortunate, you were born in Iran, you were brought up a Muslim, you were not brought up as a Christian, you're not a Christian now, you're going to hell. I mean, whereas you say to some Baptist in Tallahassee, you're lucky, you were born in Tallahassee, you were brought up as a Christian, you believe in Jesus Christ, you're going to heaven. Even if that person is, like, works for Trump, is dishonest, is hurtful, is, betrays his wife, I accept Jesus. Whereas you are a wonderful person, because as soon as you finish your interview with me, you're going down to the poor parts of Tehran, where you're going to spend the rest of the day handing out food and working with people and washing the bodies of people who are hurt and that sort of thing. I still say, yes, but Reza, you don't believe in Jesus. So that, for me, that's got nothing to do. Well, you can laugh now, but when you find you're on the way down with me, you won't be laughing. But anyhow, as I say, Adolf Hitler, very good to meet you, you know. Anyway, as I say, so my position very strongly is that science and religion don't have to clash. That religion asks different sorts of questions about the meaning of life and things like this, which I think science doesn't even set out to, it doesn't answer them, because it doesn't ask them. It doesn't ask questions about what is the meaning of life. Science asks questions about how does life work, but it doesn't ask questions about why would we have life. That, as I say, is a different matter. Richard Dawkins says it's all a joke. The Pope says because we're made in the image of God. I say I don't know, but that's not scientific discussion. So, as I say, at that level. But now you pick up, as I said in the first part of my lecture, more sociological issues, and these are particularly the issues that I've been working on, as I say, in recent years. By the way, I'm just reading a novel at the moment. You'll like this. I'm just reading a novel called God is an Englishman. God is an Englishman. So look at the size of it. And this is the first of 3 volumes, all about God being an Englishman and how good it is that God is. God was very lucky to be born English. He might have been born French. Good Lord, imagine if he'd been born French. Anyway, so as I say, I'm now much more interested in the kind of sociological issues like this, and the nature. You asked me, how do I deal with fundamentalists? Well, on the one hand, by and large, I try to be friendly with people. Because people don't believe what I believe, I don't necessarily think they're evil. I think I would find it very difficult, for instance, to be friendly with Adolf Hitler. But that's a different matter. I think Adolf Hitler was an evil man, and he did evil things. But I could well have the Pope. I think the Pope is fundamentally mistaken. But I don't hate the Pope. I don't hate the Ayatollah Khomeini. I mean, I don't. I mean, yeah, if he wants to do things which I think are wrong, but because he is a deeply committed Muslim, so he's a deeply committed Muslim. I'm not. I mean, so I've always had the attitude of trying to reach out and talk to people. And in fact, I'm well known for being on really quite good friendly terms with a lot of the creationists. I mean, I'm quite comfortable about sitting down and eating with them. That's never been an issue for me at all. Okay? So, but I recognize that I'm simply not going to change the minds of people like you. You might change your mind. You might change your mind because you've read stuff by me. But my coming and preaching to you now for an hour, let us say, about why Islam is wrong or why, America is right. It's as we say in English, it's water off a duck's back. It's not going to make any difference. So at one level, although I'm friendly with people, I recognize that there's not much I can do there. I mean, I can fight them in the courts and things like that to try to stop it being taught in schools, and I'm quite open to doing all of that. But I don't think I'm going to change minds. However, I'm a teacher, like you. I'm a professor. And my job is to talk to young people. Now, once again, you know and I know that if you just go into the classroom and start to preach, let us say, atheism or agnosticism, even if were allowed to do it, you don't want to do it because it's not right. But also, it's not going to be that effective. And if it is, it's effective for the wrong reasons. It's like the Hitler Youth. You can influence people, but you're not influencing them by making them think about it. You're influencing them by your position of authority, by offering them nice things like camps and that sort of thing. And that's not how you work. But I think what you can do is the sort of work I'm doing all the time, writing books like Can a Darwinian Be a Christian? And, as it were, making these available, having students discuss these. And when I have discussions, I always say to students, I want you to defend the position you don't believe in. So if you're an atheist, I want you to be defending Christianity. And if you're a Christian, I want you to be defending atheism. Now, it's not because I want to make you into an atheist or I want to make you into a Christian. I want to make you uncomfortable, but that's what a good teacher does. Good teachers make their students uncomfortable. But that's another matter, because what you're trying to do is make the students go out of that classroom and say, oh my God, that Ruse, he's a total asshole. But, you know, there was something there that was worth talking. And I want them late at night over a beer or cocoa or whatever it is that they have. I want them to be sitting and saying, you know, there's something there. I'm still a Christian. But, you know, I'm not sure I want to accept that there was a worldwide flood. I'm not sure that it's important for my belief in God to accept all of those. And it leads into things like global warming. You know, a lot of my Christian students would say, well, global warming is a problem, but God is going to solve it. God is all-powerful. God has given us this earth to use. We are using it. Yes, things are going wrong, but either there will be Armageddon or God will introduce a new cause which gets rid of global warming. I want my students to go out and say, yes, we can get rid of global warming. We can get rid of global warming in a Christian way. But the Christian way is to use the talents that God gave us as being made in the image of Him in order to go out and do things with it. The kind of conversations that we're having at the moment, I don't see the kind of conversation we're having at the moment as irreligious. I see the conversation that we're having as deeply religious in the sense that we're trying to explore ideas, you and me, between two cultures, us with our students. I mean, I've put them down like that, us with our students. So I don't see this as an either or, but not both. So I think the way to deal with this is to recognize what you can do and what you can't do, and work very, very hard at what you can do. Yes. Well, I think, again, at note I'm a historian as well as a philosopher. So I'm an evolutionist. So I think that understanding things is often a question of digging into the past. By about 1985, it was clear that old-fashioned creationism wasn't going anywhere. People were still believed in it, but they were not getting it into the schools. They'd lost certain crucial court cases, and it wasn't going anywhere. And then a number of people, and most prominently a man called Philip Johnson, who was a lawyer. He was a law professor at Berkeley, the famous university in California. And he became, thanks to his second marriage, he became an evangelical Christian. And he got interested in Darwinism. And he saw that old-fashioned creationism would not work. Legally, it was a non-starter. It violated the separation of church and state. But he was a lawyer and he was clever. And so he said, what we need is a version of creationism which is a lot less threatening, and I've used this word before, and a lot more, what shall I say, respectable looking. And so he came up in Darwin on Trial, which I think was published in 1991 perhaps, with what he called intelligent design theory. Now, this is not a theory which insists on an old Earth, a young Earth. It says nothing whatsoever about Noah's flood. It says nothing about the original Adam and Eve. Some even inclined to some kind of guided evolution. But what it did say was that in order to get to where we are, it could not have been done by normal, what I would call blind law. there had to be interventions by an intelligent designer. Now, Johnson was very careful. He did not say that this intelligent designer is the Christian God. He believed that it was, and we've discovered emails and phone conversations and that sort of thing, just like Trump, where they actually do say this. So if we had Mueller looking into this, that the evidence is certainly there, but they were very careful not to say this. And of course, people picked up on intelligent design theory, even the creationists, as the thin end of a wedge, because they presented intelligent design theory as a genuine scientific theory, which could, in fact, in America, be taught in schools, and did not separate the American separation of church and state. And then, in the middle of the 1990s, so as I say, Johnson was a lawyer, and he didn't pretend to be a scientist or anything like that. In the middle of the 1990s, two young men picked up the ideas and ran with them. One was a man called Michael Behe, B-E-H-E, who in fact is a Roman Catholic. He's a Catholic. But he is a scientist. And he argued that, in fact, it's impossible for natural selection to have produced the kind of complexity that we find in organisms. That the kind of way that organisms work, their complexity, is not something that could have just been done blindly by law, just like that. Even natural selection. It had to be done by this, as it were, a thinking being.
Sure.
And so he argued in his book, Darwin's Black Box, this. Now, I should say Philip Johnson welcomed this. And in fact, Philip Johnson was responsible for Behe finding a publisher and getting his book published. So it wasn't one or the other, but not both. And then this young man, who's a really good mathematician, called William Dembski, he was in Chicago, and then he went to Cambridge and did a PhD in philosophy. William Dembski argued philosophically that naturalism, working on everything through blind law, is not a good strategy, that there's going to be questions that science should answer, that it doesn't. I mean, the kind of questions we were talking about, things like meaning and these sorts of things. Dembski said there's absolutely no reason why science shouldn't deal with these, but we have to have an expanded notion of science, and this would include an intelligent designer, rather than just blind, unguided law. And so by 2000, then, on the one hand, you got Philip Johnson pushing intelligent design theory as a legal strategy to avoid trouble in the courts. And then you'd got Michael Behe arguing that intelligent design theory was necessary in order to explain the physical world or the biological world. And then at the end, you'd got Bill Dembski, Bill Dembski, arguing that philosophically. And in fact, this was very successful for a while. And then, of course, in 2005, there was another court case. The one I was involved in, it was in Arkansas in 1981, and this was in Dover, Pennsylvania, in 2005. And intelligent design theory was put on trial, and the judge ruled, just as the judge had ruled back in Arkansas, that in fact it really is religion made to look like science. And so that was basically the end of that, except there was an additional move which occurred. And then what the intelligent design people did was they altered their strategy a bit and argued not so much that intelligent design theory is better science, but that it's morally better, because Darwinism, struggle for existence, this sort of thing, led straight to Hitler. From Darwin to Hitler in one all too easy move. And so even if Darwinism can't be faulted as science, it can be faulted as morally offensive, whereas obviously intelligent design theory does not suffer from these faults. And so really up to now, we still have this argument going on that Darwinism led to Hitler. And obviously anything that led to Hitler was obviously wrong, therefore there must be something corrupt about Darwinism. So that's the sort of, if you like, the three phases of intelligent design theory. First, as a legal way to get around the legal problems of creationism, make it look like science. Then Abouheif and Dembski giving it both scientific and philosophical backing, and then finally after 2005, other people picking up on this and running with it as morally offensive, leading to Hitler, and that's been argued against. But that's the sort of history of the last 30 years of intelligent design theory. Personally, I think it's dishonest or wrong. I mean, I don't think you need an intelligent design theory even to make you and me. I think that Darwinian theory can do it. And as I've said several times in this interview, I would have more respect for a God who did it through law, through blind law, than one who had to keep interfering in his creation and saying, okay, now I'll do something more. I mean, it's rather like, somebody who makes an automobile, and you've got a choice between somebody who makes a car which lasts for 100,000 miles and somebody who makes a car and every 5,000 miles you have to take it back to have something changed. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the car which runs for 100,000 miles is a much better car than the car which has to be, radically repaired every 5,000 miles. So, as I say, I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's philosophically untenable. I don't think it leads to Hitler, but even worse, I think it's theologically inappropriate. I think it's bad. I think it's bad religion.
Okay. As the last question, can you talk a little bit about your difference with new atheists? So what is wrong with new atheists, do you think?
Well, at one level, of course, I have a lot in common with them. I mean, certainly don't accept fundamentalist Christianity, and obviously at one level I don't accept Christianity. So at that level, I'm in the same corner as Richard Dawkins, and I also obviously accept Darwinian evolutionary theory as enthusiastically as Dawkins or Dennett do. So obviously at one level there's very significant overlap. At another level, and this goes back to where right at the beginning of my talk, when I talked about my childhood and my background, I think there are terrible things wrong with Christianity. I think it has led to great social evils, and I don't know to what extent you're aware of the way that the Catholic Church has been accused of sexual abuse, and it's still a big issue at the moment. And I mean, my attitude is, if you're going to make grown men supposedly not have sex at all, you're going to have people who break down.
Sure.
And if you mix them in with little boys and little girls, it's almost like asking for trouble to happen. Sure. So, as I say, there are many aspects that I would agree with Richard Dawkins on, that Christianity is not only wrong, but at a certain level it's sometimes a moral evil. Sure. On the other hand, I don't think that Christianity always is a moral evil. I think that there have been lots of Christians who've done wonderful things in life because they were Christians. The people, for instance, who opposed slavery at the end of the 18th and 19th century, the evangelicals like the father of Samuel Wilberforce, William Wilberforce, as well as a lot of Quakers. They opposed slavery. Why? Because they felt it went against their Christian convictions. So my attitude has always been that I don't think, on the one hand, I think I would disagree with Dawkins on this, I don't think that a Darwinian cannot be a Christian. I think that there's much more intellectual room for overlap, even if it's not overlap I want to share. And also, at the same time, at the more sociological level, I don't think that Darwinism is always a moral evil. So this is where we differ. As I say, there's a huge amount of overlap, and obviously I've got a lot more overlap with somebody like Richard Dawkins than I do with an evangelical leader like Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham. A lot more overlap there. But at the same time, at another level, we're really in different things. I don't want to say it's like Sunnis and Shiites, but of course it is at one level, a lot of overlap, and yet at another level, very fundamentally different ways of regarding the Prophet and his contributions and his legacy and what it means for how we should act today. I mean, I hardly have to tell you about the differences that one is faced with. Unfortunately, we're not killing each other, but I think it's unfortunate that we can't at least sit down and be a bit more tolerant. But people like Richard Dawkins are like all religious leaders. They tend not to be very tolerant. I'm not sure that Jesus was always that tolerant, and I'm certainly sure that Muhammad was not always that tolerant either. It's a feature of charismatic leaders. You are a charismatic leader because you believe in yourself. I could never be a charismatic leader, because I'd always be saying, "Oh my goodness, maybe I'm making a mistake." And Muhammad and Jesus didn't say that, nor does Richard Dawkins.